It says we're ready to rock and roll. So can we start, Jackie?
2 seconds. Can you see the live on YouTube? It is just set.
It says, yeah, on my screen it says it's now live.
It's still saying set up for me. There we go. Just preparing to stream.
All right. It says we're ready to rock and roll. So can we start, Jackie?
We can. 2 seconds. Can you see the live on YouTube? It is just set.
It says, yeah, on my screen it says it's now live.
Perfect. We are live now. It's a bit of a delay, so I will send on the link to people, and then I will stop talking because I don't want me over talking you lot.
All right, cool. Vivek, may I start? Vivek, is that a yes?
Yes, please.
Excellent. So welcome all. Sorry for the slight delay there. I'm Mark Pagel. I'm one of the co-editors-in-chief of the Journal of Supply Chain Management. I'm just basically here to introduce you to what we're doing today. So this webinar is linked to our 2021 Emerging Discourse Incubator on the topic of managing working conditions and supply chains toward decent work. And if you want a copy of the call for papers, or if you haven't seen it, you can get it on the journal's website, or any of the panelists will gladly share it with you. I'm just going to tell you real quickly what we mean by an emerging discourse incubator and how it links to these papers, and then I'll hand you off because I know you didn't actually come to hear me. So the journal created the Emerging Discourse Incubator and did this rather clunky academic name because we weren't necessarily happy with the way a traditional special issue works. We wanted to create something a bit more. So if you sort of decompose the name, the emerging component is about trying to make sure that we're publishing research in areas that we don't think have garnered the attention they should have. And I think this is an interesting topic because I'm fairly certain a lot of you would say, well, there's lots of research on this topic, but it's traditionally done outside the supply chain management realm, which kind of means that the people who would be best placed to do something with it aren't necessarily engaging with it. So that's part one. It's an emerging topic, at least for supply chain scholars. The second idea gets that word of discourse, that we're actually trying to create a conversation. So perhaps the part I like best about this form of a special issue is that we stretch the time frame out. So the call for papers has actually been live since June. And we will be accepting submissions until December 31st, 2021. So rather than a lot of special issues where the call for paper goes up, you go, that's really cool, followed by, there's no way in hell I can meet that deadline. You should have plenty of time to meet this deadline. Equally, we start the discourse, if you will, with a series of invited papers. So for each of our EDIs, we invite globally recognized experts on the topic to try and kick off a conversation. And those are the papers you'll hear from in just a minute. And we publish those papers at the beginning of that 18-month period. So those papers will actually be live online in January of this year. And the idea is by having those invited papers up there to start a conversation, we hope that later articles will build on the earlier articles, and there'll actually be enough time for authors to converse with each other via, obviously, the publication process. The last thing I'll say about this is that while this does have a quote unquote deadline on it, the idea is not that we will never publish on this topic again after December 31st, 2021. But hopefully by the time we get to December 31st, 2021, that this topic will now be an area that is getting enough attention that is part of our regular submissions. In other words, even if 18 months isn't enough time, and I can imagine it might not be in some projects, that's fine. We'll still be publishing on these topics in the future. This is to start a conversation, not end it. If you have questions about the actual process of publishing, we're going to have an open forum at the end, and I'll gladly answer them then. Otherwise, I will hand off to the people you actually came to hear.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks everyone for, first of all, participating. And I'm Vivek Soundararajan. I'm an associate professor in international management at the University of Bath. And you're joined by a great number of panelists here. So this is an EDI, or as Mark explained, it's an emerging discourse incubator. Miriam will explain what this is a bit more when I hand over to her. So before I start the session, I just wanted to double check a couple of things and hope everyone is muted their mic. So you can ask all your questions via chat, and Mariam and I will pick the questions and ask the presenters after every presenter's presentation. So feel free to use the chat function for all your questions, for all your concerns, etc. So we will try and raise at least 2 questions after each presentation. Anything else? Yes, so you can ask questions via YouTube as well. We are monitoring YouTube too, so feel free to ask your questions via YouTube too. The structure of the webinar will be like, I'll start with an introduction, and then I'll pass the mic to Mariam, and Mariam will speak a bit about the whole process and what we are expecting in terms of submissions, and also followed by a guest speaker's presentation. Guest speakers will present their views on the current state of research on decent work in supply chains, and which will be followed by a Q&A for each and every guest speaker. Finally, we will open the floor where all participants can ask questions directly to the speakers as well as the guest editors of this emerging discourse incubator. So starting off with why we are here and what led to this emerging discourse incubator. It's an interesting story. So I come from management, but I do research on working conditions in supply chains. Mariam comes from operations management, supply chain management, and Andy comes from management as well. So we all do research on working conditions in supply chains from different perspectives. And so when we were having a conversation about that, we understood that there is so much conversation happening in silos, right? So in different disciplines, but it's time for, and we thought, like, there should be an integration of all these disciplines so that we can have, so that we can push the field forward rather than repeating the same research, same ideas again and again. And it is important because decent work is not just a topic, rather it's about, it's the lives of human workers who are contributing to the supply chain, who are being oppressed in the supply chain due to many of the supply chain practices. So I think it's more than an academic duty, rather it's a moral duty of all of us, all as scholars come together and do conduct research that can actually not just contribute to the field of working conditions in supply chains, but also help workers and help other actors to alleviate this issue of exploitation in supply chains. So that's the main inspiration for the call. So we have research happening in political science and sociology and development studies on barriers to decent work, challenges to decent work, measures to improve decent work. And in supply chain management, under the broad theme of sustainable supply chain management, you could see research on occupational health and safety, ergonomics and whatnot, right? So I think it is time for both these two different extreme scholars to speak to each other and produce research that can benefit both academia as well as workers. So with that in mind, we invited 4 scholars to contribute to this emerging discourse incubator, and along with their collaborators, they are in the process of finishing up their articles. So they will speak a bit about what they are writing, and also they will give you lots of ideas or inspirations for future research based on their interest. So we have Professor Genevieve Lebaron from University of Sheffield. We have Juliana Reinecke from King's College London. We have Peter Hessel from University of Southern Denmark. And we have Saroj Kurvilla from Cornell University, who will be speaking in this webinar. So with this, I will stop here and I'll pass the mic to Mariam, who will explain the EDI a bit more and also offer some ideas on what we expect in terms of contributions to this EDI process. Mariam?
Okay, sorry, I was for some reason not able to unmute myself. Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name is Miriam Wilhelm. I'm going to keep it short, also in the interest of time. I think Mark already gave an excellent introduction or explanation what the EDI is, so I'm not going to add a lot to that. I just want to highlight that the idea is really, other than a special issue, that we want papers to really engage with each other and build on each other, and starting also with the invited contributions. In terms of what we want to see is, of course, we want to see your creative, innovative work on working conditions in supply chain. We are open to contributions from all disciplines, but we find it important that your contribution engages with the supply chain literature. So that is not to say that you solely need to build on supply chain literature, but in order to have a conversation, it is important, we think, that you engage with the supply chain literature. Okay, so I think we can come back to that later maybe, but I want to open the floor to the first speaker. So yeah, Professor Genevieve Le Baron, she's a professor of politics at the University of Sheffield. She's an expert on forced labor, trafficking, and modern slavery in the supply chain. So I want to give the floor to our first speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'll just put the slides up. Okay, hopefully you can both hear me and see the slides. Yep, okay. Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of the session today. It's a tremendous honor to be here on a panel of scholars whose work I really respect and admire, hosted by this great journal and editor team. As the editors note in their call for papers for this special issue, supply chains are fundamental to the question of whether decent work flourishes or not. And I want to focus today on the or not part of that formulation, namely the question of how supply chains shape the patterns and dynamics of forced labor, which, as many of you will know, encompasses a variety of practices, all of which use coercion to extract involuntary labor from people. These are often described as human trafficking or modern slavery. And we know that forced labor is well documented across many types of supply chains in many sectors, ranging from agriculture, food, hospitality, construction, garments, footwear, the extractive sectors. And yet there's surprisingly little detailed, rigorous research that looks at the business dynamics of forced labor, and especially the supply chain dynamics of forced labor. And I think there's really an urgent need for better research on this. And so it's great that this is included within this excellent initiative by this journal. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes sharing with you some, a bit from my paper, which is about what research outside of management looks at in relation to these themes, and kind of, how we understand supply chains in my home discipline of politics. And then I'll spend the rest of my time sharing a few thoughts about what a supply chain and kind of specifically business and management research agenda around forced labor might look like. So there's a growing body of research on forced labor in supply chains. It's interdisciplinary. It includes work from scholars in politics, in development studies, in geography, and law, and many other disciplines. But as Mark mentioned kind of at the beginning there, one peculiar thing about this literature is that it actually contains very few scholars who are experts on supply chains. I think it's fair to say that most of us have come into this as experts either on labor and forced labor, modern slavery in particular, or experts on governance, including both corporate social responsibility, private governance, but also state governance in their interactions. And there are, of course, a few pioneering management scholars who've written about supply chain dynamics of forced labor, like Vivek and Andy, for instance. But a lot of us writing on these topics don't have any formal background or training in supply chains or even really management in general. And I think that creates a unique opportunity for those of you who do to really contribute to this research area and advance it. A couple of years ago, I did a mega literature review on the academic literature on forced labor in supply chains for the Ford Foundation. And I developed a typology that's here on the screen with some colleagues that seeks to capture across all the existing evidence and research that's out there on forced labor in supply chains, what do we know about the root causes of forced labor in supply chains? And you'll see on one side of this picture, the demand side, scholars have identified features of contemporary supply chains that they see as giving rise to and correlated with a business demand for forced labor. And again, I think the thing I want to point out here is that rather than getting into detailed analysis of supply chains or management techniques or structures, I think it's fair to say that most of this literature is really focused on a big picture analysis of supply chains as structures that permeate distributions of wealth and opportunity, and also shape exploitation in the economy. And that most of the focus has been on the labor conditions themselves, rather than the businesses and the supply chain structures that surround them. Of course, there is some excellent literature in the management and business sort of genre about supply chain dynamics and business models of forced labor, or at least that uses management concepts to try to understand the patterns of forced labor, inspired by the work of scholars like Andy Crane and others. And I think one of the key insights that emerges here is that forced labor is not randomly occurring in supply chains, but rather it happens according to predictable and stable patterns that are anchored in prevailing business models and certain types of governance regimes. And so there's a lot of research emerging now that's trying to kind of make sense of those patterns. My research has certainly happened within those themes as well. To give you kind of an example here, I investigated the patterns surrounding forced labor in supply chains in a recent study I did of cocoa and tea supply chains. And I included several different types of supply chains in my research, for instance, global supply chains producing for export, domestic supply chains producing for local consumption, supply chains that were certified and contained certified work sites, such as by Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliance versus those that did not. And I've been trying to kind of look at the big picture of the patterns here. Questions like, if a chain is led by a multinational, or if it's certified, do we see more or less forced labor, both in terms of the prevalence, but also how do the dynamics differ? So all of that is to say, I think there is a really exciting body of scholarship that's beginning to bubble up around these themes. But I think it could really benefit from more research being done by management scholars on experts on supply chains in general. So to close, I'll just briefly share a few thoughts on some considerations around what that research agenda might look like. In terms of issues, in thinking about what supply chain scholars can contribute here, as I mentioned, very, very little of the research so far has been done by experts on supply chains in particular. And I'm always curious how supply chain experts would see differently some of the same issues that have been studied already, but also really push us forward into new ways of understanding. As I mentioned so far, we know very little, both empirically and I think in terms of how we think about theoretically the supply chains that give rise to forced labor and those that do not. And we need both quantitative and qualitative evidence as well as theory about this across pretty much every issue area when it comes to contemporary business. I think just to name a few, in quantitative terms, it would be great to see research into the value of products and services, distribution of value along supply chains, geography of export, import, and sale, and how all of this is shaped by and shapes patterns of forced labor. In terms of qualitative information, we know very little about distribution of power, risk, and reward along supply chains, about the actors that exploit forced labor, what their motivations are, under what circumstances they don't exploit forced labor, etc. So there's really wide open terrain here. In terms of methods, I unfortunately don't have time to say too much about methods, but I want to just say two quick things. One, that reading through some of the supply chain management literature in preparation for my article, it did strike me that there may be a need for some methodological innovation here in order to study forced labor in the context of supply chains. I think it's fair to say that flows of people and their labor conditions are considerably more challenging to study than flows of goods and capital. And that's especially true when it comes to very vulnerable workers who confront situations of forced labor, especially when we know that victims of forced labor, that's not a kind of stable, isolatable category, but people move in and out of that category at different times in their lives, kind of moving between forced labor and more minor forms of exploitation. So it would be good to think about how methods can be harnessed to really make sense of that in a nuanced way. Oh, thank you, Vivek. I see the 2-minute warning. I also think it would be helpful, and this maybe is a surprising thing to say as a political scientist, but to be maybe a little provocative, I feel like some of the business literature that's been written on this is almost like embarrassed about the fact that they're business scholars, like they're kind of not doing what I would think of as like the really businessy kind of analysis of forced labor. And I think it would be helpful if business scholars focused on really, embracing the methods that they're specifically trained in and kind of bringing to the party, if you will, their business expertise and kind of deep understanding of management that the rest of us, just simply don't have. So for instance, there's a lot of excellent literature in management around in-depth financial dynamics and cost flows and all of that sort of stuff that would be really useful to have that kind of analysis around the supply chains of forced labor. It would be really useful to understand in greater depth, how business strategy and management practices articulate with forced labor. And we need to understand those things better. And most of us who are studying this topic at the moment, we just don't have that in-depth knowledge or expertise or training in those types of methods. So to be blunt, I'd really urge business scholars to make a proper business contribution here, rather than doing a kind of watered down version of the other social science work that's already in progress, because I think it's a really valuable and important contribution to dig deep into how those businesses and supply chains actually operate. My final point is ethics. I think I don't have much time to speak to this at the moment, but I just want to flag that in thinking about an SCM or kind of management in general research agenda on forced labor, it's really crucial to keep research ethics front and center. I don't want to go into detail here, but again, I think we need to think really creatively and reflexively about methodology and about ethics when it comes to this topic, because it obviously raises a lot of important themes, given that it's vulnerable people, it's often illegal activity, so we can't just sort of throw it into some of our normal ethical or methodological approaches and hope for the best. I'll leave it there and look forward to the rest of the session.
Thank you, Genevieve. What a provocative presentation. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't expect less. Thank you so much. I guess a couple of questions from panelists, but also I'm very interested in asking one question by myself. So you collaborate with business scholars as well, and so what are the challenges you see in collaborating with business scholars?
No challenges, Vivek. It's been a tremendous experience from start to finish. Just kidding. If many of you don't know, the scholars I've collaborated mostly in business are Andy and Vivek. So I have to be careful what I say here. But no, I think one of the challenges relates to this point that I made, that Mark also made, which is that a lot of us have come into studying supply chains and we think we know exactly what we're talking about. Because we've sort of studied corporations and capitalism as part of our political economy scholarship. And then it turns out that those who study those things from a business perspective and who are in management schools often bring, a different set of lenses to that. And so we're using similar terminology, but we're actually often talking about very different things. And a lot of it, I think, is a levels of analysis issue, whereas you guys know so much more about the nitty gritty of how supply chains and businesses operate, that you tend to kind of get into the weeds of it in a way that can be a bit challenging if you're outside of that literature and you've not been trained, and you don't really understand some of the nuances of, the debates in the management literature that pertain to these issues. So that's a challenge, but I would say overall just tremendous benefits. And I really urge, all the business scholars out there to find a political scientist and vice versa to work with, because it's really been very enriching. Okay, so final question. So you have seen both certified suppliers as well as non-certified suppliers and their practices in forced labor. So do you see any differences? And if so, like what are those differences? Yeah, that's a great question. So in the study that I mentioned that I showed the slide of the cocoa tea, we included work sites that were certified and uncertified. And we quite deliberately constructed our sample to actually even oversample for different types of certification, because I was so curious whether we would see, given that Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliance and these different certifiers set standards around no forced labor, as well as different standards around wages, et cetera, whether we would actually see a difference on the ground. The kind of headline from the T side of the study is that we saw absolutely no difference when it came to the patterns of forced labor and the prevalence of it between certified and uncertified. So we had 12 different indicators of labor abuse, and across all of the tea plantations in the study, certified and non-certified fared almost identically when it came to those measurements of forced labor. So we found that certification is not making a difference, and it's not creating work sites that are free from abuse. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the presentation. Thanks for answering all the questions as well. It was very insightful to hear you speak. Thank you so much, Genevieve. My pleasure. So with that, we will move on to the next presentation. So the next presentation is by Professor Juliane Breneke from King's College London. She's a professor of international management and sustainability. Juliana does research on transnational governance as well as social movements. So the floor is yours, Juliana. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Okay, let me start share my screen. Okay, yeah, just to echo Genevieve's words, it's a tremendous pleasure to be on this panel, to see kind of familiar faces, and to have this conversation, which we often have in journals, and now we have it in this panel form. So the kind of paper that I want to present an extract from, it also started very interestingly with a conversation amongst an industrial relations scholar and myself. I was looking more at CSR, transnational governance, and a supply chain scholar. That was about 8 years ago. And we talked about our teaching and what types of teaching we have. And at some point we realized that we all teach exactly the same thing, but from all these different perspectives. So we started collaborating, myself with this is the outcome of work with Jimmy Donaghy, who is an industrial relations scholar at the University of South Australia. And what we want to talk about here is to kind of present an agenda towards worker-driven supply chain governance and making an argument for needing research for how we can develop decent work through democratic worker participation. And so our main argument in this paper here is to say that decent work really requires the democratic participation of workers. So decent work and economic growth is part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which the ILO, which is the UN agency that is charged with implementing decent work conditions, maps onto the another sustainable development goal to ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels, which is this ILO social dialogue agenda. So the core argument is that we really need to incorporate workers and their representatives into supply chain governance systems at both levels, the level of the sourcing, the buyer company, but also at the level of the supplier to ensure decent work. And that kind of grows out of a frustration with existing models of supply chain governance. And often the problem that in the whole notion of managing supply chain sustainability, it implies that this is a managerial task with performance outcomes to be considered, rather than looking at it as a political contest of inherently conflicting interests that need to be both represented and to be negotiated. And of course, we know existing models, social auditing, monitoring, codes of conduct, they're ineffective. Many scholars like Genevieve, you have worked a lot on this, shown how ineffective these models are. Another frustration is that workers are often seen as peripheral stakeholders, which of course, especially in labor-intensive industries, they're not peripheral, they're very central to the whole supply chain. And very often there's little or no attention given to collective worker representation. So I think there's, again, a huge need and opportunity to actually look at the role of workers and worker representation in decent work governance architectures. And to kind of look at this argument, I want to propose a short kind of excursion into more the political economy, because I think to understand this issue of democratic worker participation, we need to consider the broader geography of production and consumption in global supply chains. And the global supply chain model, with its fragmented and multi-tier structures, has really undermined the Fordist social contract of a wage-led growth and worker participation at multiple levels, including national democratic institutions. Because if you think about what was the Fordist model was basically, one of the innovation was that the worker was supposed to be able to afford the products that he or she was producing. So there was kind of an equivalence between the worker also being the consumer. That has been broken up in global supply chains, where we kind of see the geographic, political, but also economic separation of who the worker is and who the consumer is. So we actually see a suppression of real wage growth and demand created through price suppression and generally downward pressure on labor standards. So within this kind of broader model, I think what this has really led to is a lack of opportunities for democratic worker representation that have always been very contested and have always been a struggle to implement. But in the global supply chain model, we really don't see effective structures for this. So I want to propose to look at existing concepts about worker participation, and particularly the concept of industrial democracy. Industrial democracy is about enabling democracy in industry. Many definitions, one of which the structures and institutional mechanisms that give workers or their representatives the opportunity to influence organizational decision-making in their places of employment. So democratic worker representation traditionally takes the form of trade unions, at the supply chain level, can take the form of international framework agreements that are negotiated between global union federations and a multinational corporation and covers the supply chain of that corporation, but also other forms of elected worker representation. I think what is very, very powerful notion is that it recognizes the structured antagonism, that's kind of an employment relations concept, between workers and management's diverging interests. It kind of recognizes that this is kind of a political relationship which requires forms of political representation. It's not a technical issue that needs to be managed, but it needs to be subject to political negotiation and therefore democratic representation of different political interests. And with the time that I have, I want to focus on a sort of framework for worker-driven supply chain governance, proposing that we can, where worker voice and democratic representation can take place. And as the basic kind of differentiation, we could think about, does it happen at the level of the supplier factory, at the coal face of where often labor rights violations happen, where forced labor happens, often at the upstream end of global supply chains. Voice at the coal face could be trade unions, could be mechanisms of workplace social dialogue at factory level. But on the other hand, we could also think about how voice at transnational levels could be facilitated, how what is the role of buyers and of global retailers in enabling mechanism of voice. And this is also where I can see a lot of opportunity for research by supply chain scholars. So for instance, at the level of the coal face, I think it really focuses on ensuring that a company's monitoring and enforcement mechanisms are really designed to provide an effective voice for workers in the protection of their own rights. So what could be these mechanisms? Often codes of conduct typically involve freedom of association rights, which Sarosh is going to talk about more, but often they're not implemented. And what is the role that maybe multinational corporations can play? Okay, great, Vivek. What is the role that multinational corporations can play in helping to implement these process rights at the level of their suppliers? Another element, if we then look further at the level of the multinational corporation, the transnational level, that really invites scholars to understand how maybe types of corporations can take place with worker organization, with global union federations, for instance. Supply chain scholars have focused more recently at collaborations with NGOs, but I think there's a lot of work to be done to look at more collaborations from that particular perspective with representative worker organizations. I think another area for research that it also opens up is that I think such an agenda might significantly impact supply chain management strategies and practices. For instance, the creation of new performance indicators for concrete measurable outcomes for how workers participate, how effective this is, and so on. Potentially also aspects of supplier selection, how worker participation can be built into this. So I think there are multiple aspects where supply chain scholars can really add their particular expertise and knowledge to help drive this, this agenda forward. And so I think I want to end here. Vivek is already waving. Yeah, thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to this emerging conversation. You're muted, Vivek, you're muted.
I keep on forgetting this. So yeah, so thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation and very insightful as well. So I will summarize 2 questions by attendees. Both are related to some extent. So one is, what are the challenges in enabling workers' participation and voices, and how the realities has changed when it comes to workers' participation during COVID-19?
Okay, wow, these are 2 fantastic questions. I think the challenges to worker participation is, I think the biggest challenge is that it could be seen to erode managerial control, both at the level of factories. In my research, I've seen often that factory managers are very, very reluctant to seek any sort of voice to workers because they're afraid that it undermines their authority. And often that relationships are not very constructive, but they're often very antagonistic, and that this antagonism is going to be aggravated. And so I think it's overcoming that reluctance towards kind of more productive industrial relations and seeing this as kind of a positive aspect of the decent work agenda, rather than something that needs to be suppressed. And I think that is a massive challenge. In terms of the COVID situation, I mean, I think this is I mean, as in so many things, I think it has really driven so many good initiatives that have existed, kind of thrown it backwards, because I mean, we have seen order cancellations from Western retailers. In Bangladesh alone, until the end of the year, about 2 million workers are expected that they might lose their jobs due to the COVID situation and cancelled orders and so on. So I think we see kind of massive problems. And I think what we see, and I think more systematic research would be amazing in places where we do see strong worker participation, that workers were able to negotiate better conditions, or at least continuing payment while factories might be closed, might not be in production. So we kind of see positive benefits. But I think, I mean, this has undermined so much that has been going on. Yeah.
Yeah, it has changed everything, isn't it? It has taken us back by, say, like 10, 15 years. At least that is what I see in some of the research I do research on. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for
you.
And thanks for answering the questions as well. So let's move on to the next presentation. So the next presentation is by Professor Peter Hassel. Professor Peter Hassel is a professor of global operations in University of Southern Denmark, and he does research on occupational health and safety. And he has been conducting research on occupational health and safety for a very long time. And recently he has started doing research on garment industries and Bangladesh, specifically within the Bangladesh context as well, and specifically on occupational health and safety. And so he has been developing very novel insights recently specifically on the topic of occupational health and safety. Thank you so much, Peter, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to join this panel, both learning from the 2 former speakers, but also giving possibilities to link up. We're just starting a new project on studying the role of audits in garment, which Genevieve also talked about. And one of the things we are going to look more into is the question about worker participation, which haven't been particularly strong in the interventions I'm going to talk about now. I'll just share my screen. Yes. So I'm going to talk about interventions we've been working on for the last 5 years in Bangladesh and Myanmar, interventions in the garment industry, where we have tried to, in factories, try to introduce improvements of occupational health and safety, integrated with productivity development. And I will talk a bit about why we have taken this approach, our experience so far, and some interpretations about the successes and failures of our intervention activities. First, it's of course important to realize that there is this dilemma saying that there is an economic growth in these countries. In Bangladesh, we have 80% of export earnings or more is from garment, and 5 million women, they have a job in garment, which they wouldn't have if it was for these outsourcing activities. At the same time, as we know, it's causing precarious and hazardous jobs. And the question is how then to find ways to create decent work. And the general trend at the moment is to have external pressure from various sources, mainly 3 different approaches. You have international trade agreements, which through government regulation is putting pressure on suppliers to develop decent work. We have a buyer's code of conduct, where all the larger brands at least have their own code of conduct, and they are most often auditing them. And we have a number of multi-stakeholder initiatives, both international standards and also initiatives. Maybe the most successful so far is the Accords in Bangladesh after Rana Plaza. But a major problem with these approaches is that it's a coercive pressure on the suppliers, and there are many studies saying that the impact in the suppliers is not very large, and an important reason for that is a deep coupling between policy and practice. If we take the buyer code of conduct, then they have procurement departments procuring, trying to secure price and quality, and then you have CSR departments trying to follow up on buyer codes of conduct not being particularly strong. So and in the suppliers, they are realizing that it's not the core interest of the buyer to fulfill the code of conduct, so they are doing window dressing. And the end is that policy and practice is decoupled. So what we have been working with is try to develop an integrated approach to interventions, where we are not solely focusing on improvements of decent work and in particular health and safety. And the reason for that is that health and safety, decent work, working conditions, interventions, then tend to isolate this issue into a sidecar, quite isolated from shop floor operations. Suppliers, they put that responsibility to a compliance manager who has nothing to do with what's going on at the shop floor. And it's not seen as something which is contributing to business. So we developed a design saying that we used lean as a tool to work with both productivity and quality, and the other hand, decent work, in particular focusing on occupational health and safety. We used lean because it has the advantage of being, in principle, fairly simple, requiring a low investments, focusing on the actual work going on, meaning that we could also look at the economic situation for the workers, the physical strain on the workers. And then the idea was with helping the suppliers through change management or action research, we could help them improve both productivity and decent work. And the outcome is that we actually help solving the decoupling and sidecar issues. We have in some of the suppliers, we have quite large improvements of productivity and quality. And we can, from our experience now, say that in almost all garment factories in Bangladesh and Myanmar, you can improve quality and productivity with 25 to 50%, almost without investments. And at the same time also improve health and safety of the workers and involved workers stronger. We also have some studies saying that they actually experience less muscular pain and less fatigue from the improved process flow. But then the peculiar experience was that some of the factories, they couldn't actually implement almost nothing. And in most of the factories, longer term sustainability was low. So changes, they tended to wear away. And what we experienced was that there's a dominant logic for production coming from top managers telling that the way to be competitive in international supply chains is to keep salaries low and avoid any side cost for health and safety and other things. So even we could show in the best business interest that they could earn money from higher productivity, they didn't care about that because it was not part of this logic. We want to keep salary down. Most of them, they have a huge hidden cost in workers leaving all the time, shopping around to find a place which is slightly better. They use a lot of money to train them for production, but it's a hidden cost. They don't see it at all. So that's what we are then writing about now, is trying to understand this dominant logic, and also then trying to, what we are suggesting but haven't tested, how to get around that problem in interventions. And we have then used some of the newer inputs from institutional theory about institutional work to develop an expanded model where we are thinking of focusing more on the understanding of production and work with what we call experimental spaces in the factories, and work more with anchoring. Part of the problem is also that line supervisors and workers, they are afraid of changing. What's the future if they change the way they do the work? Is it something management is really serious about? Do we have the qualifications for the new way of working? Several issues like that, which we didn't experience sufficiently on when we carried out our intervention, but where we believe that there are possibilities of including the understandings, the emotions of managers, middle managers, supervisors, and workers more in the intervention process, and thereby also starting to develop this institutional logics interfering with the change work, and then start to change the dominant logic. And then we also, I started criticizing the external pressure, but we also believe it's necessary to have both external pressure and then have this integrated supplier development, which we have tried and tested in our interventions, to slowly institutionalize the norms for how production is carried out, that you can integrate health and safety improvements and productivity improvements. So that's my words. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, Peter, thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and also very innovative approach of doing research. So I would like to ask you a question and relate also to something somebody just posted on the chat from the audience. So the way I understand it is that you use your intervention approach through lean practices, right? And that by this you can couple productivity improvements with improvements in occupational health and safety. Mm-hmm. Would you say that this interventionist approach is particularly suitable for those those area of labor that are very, how can I put it, technical, like health and safety, or could it also work for facilitating worker voice or addressing gendered issues in labor, like sexual harassment, or yeah, do you have any ideas on that? Like, would your interventionist approach also be possible for other types of addressing other types of labor problems?
Yeah, I think so, because I think a key issue is that we want to have it linked to the way production is going on. So I think we need to develop routines for how to involve workers, and part of that is if you develop some of the lean tools, visual management tools, for instance, in lean, so that you have a weekly 10 minutes meeting about what are we going to produce this week, then suddenly you're actually gathering workers and making a possibility of saying something, because the idea is that you ask, do we face any obstacles completing these tasks we have the coming week? So it opens possibilities, but of course you see all kinds of constraints. This very strong hierarchical system, workers, they are not used to raise their voice, so there are issues to work on in order to do so. But I think it opens possibilities to be tested, and I think we need to focus much more on integrating in the routines of the operations, because most of decent work and health and safety activities, they are separated. So it's always something, a few people, a few experts, they are taken care of on the sideline, or you have a meeting in a committee where the workers are, but on the daily work, the workers, they don't have any kind of influence.
Yeah. That's a challenge. I can see that. I want to pick up one question that was just posted by someone from the audience. So somebody's asking, or Jin-Sun is asking, if your project involved buyers, and if these buyers allowed suppliers to experiment with new production practices, by adjusting their purchasing practices.
Yeah, we have actually been working together with Danish bestsellers and Swedish H&M, and they are very interested in this kind of supplier development. And there's one trend among at least some of the major brands that they want to help developing their key suppliers. And they are also starting to grade that key suppliers they are working closely with, that they actually get on a higher level, and then they get long-term orders. So there's a mutual benefit for both suppliers and buyers in doing that. So I think we can actually dig into a growing trend in working in this manner, at least with some of the maybe more ambitious international brands.
Okay, thank you very much. In the interest of time, thanks a lot for your presentation. We will come back to other questions, I think, at the end of the session. But I want to move on to our fourth and final presentation for today, which is by Sarosh Kuruvilla. Sarosh is a professor of industrial relations, Asian studies and public affairs at Cornell Universities. His research is mostly focused on comparative industrial relation and national human resource practices and policies. And I would like to give the floor to Sarosh.
Hi, everybody. It looks like I'm unmuted, so I have the right to talk. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. One of the problems in being the last speaker is that, many of the things I wanted to say has already been said. So I want to particularly say that my focus is on freedom of association and collective bargaining, which is worker voice, and Julian's framework on worker-driven supply chains covers the basic ideas built in freedom of association, collective bargaining. So I need to, rethink what I'm going to say and focus it at a little different level. So the first thing I want to remind everybody in this audience is that freedom of association and collective bargaining are core labor rights, and they've been core labor rights broadly accepted by the international community since 1919, and have been reiterated in so many different international treaties and conventions as a human right, and so on, as a universal declaration of human rights. So this is a very, very fundamental right. And we know from at least 100 years of research, ever since Sidney and Beatrice Webb first developed the notion of industrial relations by sort of saying that you avoid exploitation of workers by having minimum standards and having labor unions, right? And that was the birth of the field of industrial relations. It was the birth of the London School of Economics also, right? But and that is the central idea in how we improve labor conditions. We improve labor conditions by having minimum standards, laws, and having labor unions to advocate for those conditions. Okay, so we have 100 years of research in all kinds of industries to show that freedom of association and collective bargaining works. Now we come to, so you have the rights are well established. Now you have the issue of what is it like in global supply chains, particularly in apparel industries and electronics industries, in low-cost supply chains, which are by and large in the third world. Of course, we have one or two examples of low-cost supply chains in Manhattan and Los Angeles in garment industry, but by and large, the garment industry is located in third world countries, right? And what is the state of freedom of association and supply chains? And the answer is that we generally know that unionization and collective bargaining is not well developed in Myanmar. It's not well developed in Cambodia. It's not well developed in Bangladesh. But we really know very little about just how it's operating in the global supply chain, right? And this is largely because we don't have evidence, because global companies who practice private regulation, H&M, for example, has a private regulation program. All companies have a private regulation program, but they don't share the data of how effective that program is. They don't share the data of how many factories are unionized. They don't share the data of, how is worker voice working actually, right? And it's very difficult to access that data. We do know, and I've worked for 2 years trying to get data on private regulation on a number of companies. It has taken me 2 years to get the data. I've got it. The picture is not good. It's coming out in my book next March, so hold on till then. It's explosive, but okay. So where we do have evidence of freedom of association in global supply chains, we know that it improves compliance with the codes of conduct. It improves working conditions. We know that. Very few number of cases where it exists, but where it exists, man, it really works well. Okay. So now the question is, companies, and most companies will agree with me, that they constantly strive to improve how their programs work. This is what company management is supposed to do, right? Improve how programs work. And so we know that you want to improve working conditions and the lives of workers in the supply chain. One thing that always works is freedom of association, right? Proven, multiple industries, proven in the supply chain. So the question is, why don't companies push this idea of freedom of association in supply chains? Because they don't seem to be doing that. So it's on one hand, companies talk about the relentless pursuit of perfection, right, in all of their dimensions. So, one of the ways that the relentless pursuit of perfection would be to sort of ensure that all of their supply chain factories have some degree of worker voice through unions or through committees, but some degree of worker voice. Okay, now, people in political science and industrial relations and sociology have tried to study this for a long time. And we have by and large failed to make an impact in the studying of this activity in global supply chains because we just don't have access to the data. Companies do not want to share data with us, largely because the data they don't look very good. Right? So this is where supply chain management people have a phenomenal advantage, because supply chain management people don't talk to corporate social responsibility people like we do. They talk to sourcing people. So they're talking to a different animal in the company, right? The person in the company that actually has the power to decide where you're going to source from, right? There's another thing, those sourcing people are really interested in efficiency, making the supply chain more efficient. Supply chain management researchers are also interested in the logic of efficiency. That ties them because they're also interested in improving delivery times, optimizing the supply chain. This is a word that we see often in the supply chain management literature. So that makes them ideal bedfellows, and therefore supply chain management researchers can really do great research on sourcing strategies. So whereas, industrial relations people, we're looking at how effective are codes of conduct in improving worker standards. And so that is, we're looking at how legitimized or what is the legitimacy of corporate social responsibility effort. So these very different logics are being followed by IR and political science researchers versus supply chain researchers. So we know, through the research, there are lots of barriers to unionization, for all kinds of workers, and particularly for supply chain workers. I mean, I realize, of course, that I'm talking to many academicians in Europe and England in this webinar who are covered by collective bargaining agreements. I'm an American academic. I'm like a supply chain worker. I'm not covered by a collective bargaining agreement or a union, right? So we know lots of barriers here to unionization. So what would be some research questions that the supply chain guys could engage in that would actually bring about a greater focus on improving worker voice? So a key research question is about sourcing strategies. We know from research that the companies who have codes of conduct, their sourcing strategies are not integrated with their compliance strategies. So purchasing practices are often a cause of lousy working conditions, right? And in most companies, these are not integrated. We've done studies about the degree of this integration, and we find that in most companies they're not. In fact, the compliance department of H&M does not even have access to the sourcing data, right, of their companies. So this makes it impossible for the company to have a unified view. In one hand of the company sort of saying improve labor standards, the other hand of the company saying, hey, depress costs, because that's the way sourcing people are rewarded. So I think that's the key element in how supply chain researchers could get access and do the kind of fundamental research about sourcing strategies, what goes into the sourcing strategy, how do they look at institutional landscapes, how do they evaluate where to source from Cambodia versus Bangladesh, both low-cost locations. What is the importance of institutional conditions? These are areas in which people like me can't get access to do the research, but sourcing people can. I think that the COVID-19 raises some fundamental questions that would actually help supply chain management researchers have a greater impact. Because one thing that COVID-19 is questioned is, okay, maybe we need to talk about not so much about supply chain optimization for thing, but we need to talk about supply chain resilience. How do you create supply chains that will be resilient to global pandemics like like we're going through now, and typically that kind of resilience is built through more long-term partnerships with your suppliers, and more long-term partnerships means little more close guaranteeing of orders for several years, which also means more collaboration, and which is also a vehicle to improve workers' lives through the introduction of freedom of association and so on. So if you want more resilient supply chains, improving workers' lives is a crucial element of that. And here, this is how COVID-19 provides supply chain researchers with an entry to actually make a difference in terms of workers' lives. I can talk about other ways in which SCM researchers can improve and take to different extent the research that we in industrial relations and social science have done, but you'll find more practical suggestions like that in the paper when it comes out. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarosh. I would like to pick up one question that someone from the audience asked, and that is that a lot of workers in the garment sectors are actually contract workers. So is there any particular freedom of association model for contract workers and casual workers, or how should companies deal with contract workers?
Right. So one of the responses, I'm talking about current responses. In most countries, contract workers are not covered under collective bargaining legislation. In many countries, they're not. So I realize where that question is coming from. But one of the things that I'm hearing from the companies as they reconfigure their supply chains after COVID this was a process they started even before, to develop long-term partnerships. They're trying to ensure that the number of workers in the supplier factories that they source from, that ratio of regular workers to temporary workers changes. We have a lot of research coming out that clearly shows that compliance of all kinds is much weaker in factories where the ratio of temporary casual workers is higher than the ratio of regular workers. So one direction is to sort of give the supplier management more stability by sort of saying, we will give you long-term orders, so you don't have to sort of engage with this flexibilization strategy. You can have regular workers, and regular workers' working conditions are much better. So that's the direction in which leading companies who are reformulating their supply chains and rationalizing them and creating these partnerships are going in. And so that would be the answer to that.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, since we are a little bit over time, I would like to open the floor to the whole audience, and give the audience a chance to ask questions to the whole panel. Andy Crane will moderate this discussion, so I will hand over to Andy.
All right, thanks, Miriam. Yeah, I think we've had a really wonderful, very rich conversation today. And I think some of the main themes that have come out have been around the importance of this kind of crossing disciplines. I mean, many of our speakers have started off in one discipline, but have moved across, have worked with other people in different disciplines, breaking down silos. And I think as we go forward with this type of research, there's clearly a great advantage to bringing together supply chain management researchers with people from either other sub-disciplines within management as well as other disciplines outside of management as well. So I think we've got some great opportunities there if people are willing to take them. And then secondly, another theme I think which really came out of the discussion is a kind of lack of detailed knowledge about the supply chain management aspects of decent work and exploitation, as opposed to detailed knowledge on the kind of worker effects, on the broader governance structures, etc. And so the more we can put those pieces of the jigsaw together, I think we can really start to kind of expand our knowledge of this space. And I think in terms of, we had lots of questions come up on the chat, and I want to bring some of them together and ask a couple of questions to the panelists and also to the organizers, actually. In terms of three major themes which have come up in the chat, and I think if people can carry on posting questions in the chat, we'll pull those through too. But the themes that have come through really for me around theory, method, and impact. And so in terms of theory, I think these are kind of fascinating questions came through on, well, what kind of theories are going to be useful for the type of research that we're doing here, crossing boundaries and understanding the supply chain management aspects of decent work. I mean, Peter was talking about institutional theory. Other speakers spoke about kind of theories around kind of industrial democracy and those sorts of things, around forced labor. But what theories specifically from the supply chain management literature might be useful here. And I'm wondering if perhaps either Mark, Pagel, or Miriam might be able to throw some light on that. I'm going to put you on the spot now. What kind of theories do you think are going to be useful or interesting? Mark, let me ask you first.
I really wish I knew that question was coming. Because my answer would, off the top of my head, would have been pretty impolite. One of the biggest problems the supply chain management discipline has always had has been borrowing theories from other places and pasting them onto supply chain problems when the level of analysis in a supply chain tends to be different. In other words, when we borrow from strategy, it's for a firm, but we're looking at multiple firm relationships. Or we borrow from OB about relationships, but it's one-to-one human relationships, not one organization with another organization. So my off the top of my head answer here would probably be that if you're borrowing theory to do research in this area, you're probably going about it the wrong way. That I think that, you know, if you look at, to me, one of the common themes in all of the speakers and looking at all the early drafts of their papers is that what we're presently doing doesn't work, right? That we've been banging on this door for a while. We've got codes of conduct, we've got interventions that we know work in certain settings, but they're not working in others, and so on. And I would argue that one of the reasons they don't work is that we don't have a good understanding of supply chains in terms of what happens when you introduce new practice into a supply chain in terms of actually what kinds of outcomes do you get. Because we study those using theories and ideas that come from individual firms or individual people. So my very long answer to your question is we actually, in the process of doing this work, are more likely to be creating theory than applying theory.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer, Mark. Miriam, do you have anything to add for that?
Sorry, I'm struggling with the video. Yeah, I was just, luckily Mark went first, so I had some time to think about it. Yeah, I think there is really no theory on labor in supply chains. And you see people, as Mark said, borrowing theories from other fields. So some institutional theory where people talk about decoupling. So why is it not working? But I feel that maybe what supply chain scholars can do is also to fundamentally go back to the basics, which is, for me, the buyer-supplier relationship, right? Because I think a lot of the labor problems are arising from the fact that a lot of the supply chains are very cost-effective supply chains, and there's always this tension between costs and labor. And particularly in Juliane and Sarosh, presentation, I was thinking the whole time about how could this conflict be resolved? Because it is important, of course, to have more industrial democracy or freedom of association. And as Sarosh also highlighted, it does lead to better labor compliance. But still, the question is why companies are not doing it. So I'm wondering if we as supply chain scholars can go back to what we're actually good at, to think about advantages of buyer-supplier relations that could maybe help to resolve this obvious tension between, higher costs for labor or good labor conditions and the efficiencies that the supply chains are usually geared towards right now.
Yeah. Okay, great. And the other the second aspect was really around methods, and we had quite a few questions come up, which were asking about specific panelists, but I think a kind of general question here is how do we get good measures of some of the things we're interested in? So in John Viev's case, somebody was asking, so how do you measure these kind of degrees of forced labor so that we know that that certified versus uncertified sites have the same effects, right? So what are the kind of measurement challenges there? And also people were questioning around getting data access, right? So how do we understand, how can we get access to worker voice, for example? So if we're interested in worker participation, how do we really get access to it? What are the ethical issues involved in getting access to it, and all those kind of sorts of things. So I wonder if Geneviève and then Julien can perhaps answer some of those questions briefly.
Sure, those are great questions. I think the first thing to say is that we're at very early stages of developing methods that can rigorously and accurately capture labor unfreedom in supply chains. So we're doing it with great difficulty. I mean, there's not kind of like a magic formula to give out of like, here you go. There are some of us in the field who've been thinking about this for a long time. We published a book with Oxford a couple of years ago, specifically about methodological challenges in relation to forced labor research. So that might be a good resource to check out. I also published the full methodology of my tea and cocoa project in a report that's free online. You can read that, and I'm turning it into a book, which will have an even more elaborate description. But I think in general, the point is that we need to think very carefully about this. There's a trend in research to do this kind of method. Are you a modern slave? Yes, no. And asking people, and like it's a 1 or a 0. And that, you know, is just deeply problematic for many reasons, as has been widely documented now in the field. So the point is to try to grasp and to try to understand the nuances of people's situations. And there are different methods out there that can help you. I think it's important to develop them, though, in relation to the specific workers and contexts that you're looking at there. And I'll just leave it there to leave time for others.
Okay, thanks. Julien?
Okay, can you hear? I just changed my speaker. Okay, great. I mean, yes, I agree on the access issue, but I think if scholars are willing to go out and make their hands dirty, in my experiences, trade unionists are very willing to speak to researchers, are very willing to meet researchers, are very willing to share their struggles. I think it's of course very time consuming. It's of course a qualitative form of collecting data, which is very, very intensive as well to do. But I think that can provide us some access and some insider access into what might be going on. Of course, there might be challenges in terms of translation and so on. But I think that's definitely a way for people who are willing to do this, and I think we need more of that. I think from the research side, I think coming in as a supply chain scholar, I think is actually quite a good strategy, because I do think that many both at the factory level and at the say retailer level, I think there are many managers who are struggling with this issue of industrial relations, employment relations. How do I deal with unions? How do I deal with labor? And I think if scholars can establish that sort of trust, that it's also going to be something, some kind of useful, beneficial outcomes for managers to improve their practices, I think there's also an opportunity to be gained. I share what Suresh expressed, to get quantitative data from companies. If anybody can do that, I think that will be super valuable, but it's very, very challenging to convince companies to share that sort of data, because they often see that as very, very sensitive, very, very kind of competitive information. But I think would be super useful.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, the story, I think, is that for theory, we need to be creative, right, in terms of developing new theories. And in terms of method, we have to be creative in finding new ways of trying to find out both developing the appropriate metrics, but also where to discover and unravel new data. And the final aspect was about impact. And a number of questions came around about kind of actual solutions and what is working right now, and how can we do research to evaluate what's working. And there seemed to be, a whole bunch of some of the discussions that happened across the presentations, which are about both the kind of technical solutions that we might get in supply chain management. And I think Peter, for example, spoke, I think, very well about we can find even a business case. What a great finding. There's a business case for improving working conditions. And Sarosh said the same thing. And yet it's not happening. So we need to understand better the kind of the social dimension to this, right? The kind of organizational behavior dimensions to it, which is not necessarily the kind of traditional strength, perhaps, of supply chain management researchers, but probably has to be going forward. So in terms of actual solutions, I guess the kind of questions really are, how do we develop this kind of integration, both across these different departments of companies? And again, we had another question just came up about, it's not just about efficiency, it's about customer service might be a good driver for decent work. So how do we connect up what's happening in the marketing department to what's happening in the procurement department to what's happening in sustainability? So how do we get this kind of integration across departments, as well as the kind of integration for us as researchers across our kind of knowledge, our kind of disciplines of understanding these things? So Peter, I wonder if you and then Sarosh afterwards can say just something about this kind of question of actual solutions and how we can take this to the next step about trying to evaluate solutions that happen in a more integrated way across companies.
Okay, thank you. I think that you can make isolated interventions like we have been doing. What I would also like to see more is more collaboration with the buyers, because our experience is that quite a number of buyers, they are interested in this type of approach. And what we have also been considering is then a stronger involvement of local universities. And I think actually also for the journal, it would be good to promote that we get papers from universities in Bangladesh, Cambodia, and so on. But in Bangladesh, they have many universities with textile engineering departments, production engineering. So they have a lot of resources which are not now used for any kind of development. So there are possibilities, I think, of testing and studying at the same time, relations between buyers, suppliers, universities, universities from industrialized buyer countries, universities in local supplier countries, to develop some of these improvements on a broader scale, and also get around this problem that even if you have a business case, they don't pursue it because they have another understanding, which what we have learned.
Okay, great. And Sarosh, any thoughts on how we can make these kind of real solutions and how we can participate in that as researchers?
Yeah, so I think that the key, and this is also a question on the chat from Mayvan, the key really is how is procurement and labor conditions in the supply chain integrated? Our general belief is that it's not integrated in most companies. I've just finished a study of a huge retailer, global retailer, and we've looked at this integration process and how they have managed to integrate it. It took 7 years. It took the effort came more from the procurement side, not from the compliance side. Compliance side has always been wanting integration, but only when the procurement guys got ready, and it was driven by the fact that procurement needed more stable partners in their supply chain. So they needed to have long-term relationships, and because they needed to have long-term relationships, compliance was also a partner. So they created these scorecards, where they could evaluate suppliers, on speed, on cost, on delivery, on innovation, and how the suppliers were able to improve on labor standards and assign scores to them such that all of them get taken into consideration. It's also crucial that the procurement department's performance appraisal, how they are evaluated, links their performance to not only cost and delivery, but also to sustainability in the supply chain, right? So it required that. So that's what we are finding. And I think supply chain management researchers are far more capable of getting into and talking with the sourcing people that are crucial partners in anything that the company does to improve labor standards in the supply chain. That's one. The second thing slightly different, and that is that I think the challenge for supply chain researchers is, supply chain researchers typically study one company at a time. But if you want to improve labor standards in the global supply chain, you often have to take a team approach with several companies working together. And so that's a big shift for supply chain researchers. How do you study all the 10 firms who are operating in Cambodia, the biggest players and sourcing from Cambodia? How do you get all of those 10 to work in order to push freedom of association in their supplier factories? So that's a big shift. But it's clear that no company can do this by themselves. So it has to be in. There's a really good example called ACT, which is a group of 15 brands who've come together to sort of improve freedom of association and living wages in the supply chain. They're starting work. Similarly, there's a freedom of association protocol in Indonesia, also involving multiple brands. So I think a methodological challenge for supply chain researchers may be that how do you go from studying one firm to studying a group?
Absolutely, yes. Thanks, Sarosh and Peter. I think some really great points there. So in the interest of time, I think I should hand back to Vivek just for a brief conclusion. Vivek?
Thank you, Andy. Thank you so much, all the panelists. What a way to end the week, isn't it? So much information in my mind now. I don't know what to do with it. So thank you so much. On behalf of Andy, Miriam, Mark, we would like to thank all the panelists for their time and insights. It was amazing. Thank you so much. It was very kind of you to give your time in these uncertain times. And thank you all the attendees as well. Thanks for attending. And we tried to answer as many questions as possible. We could not because of time limitations, but feel free to write to us separately or directly contact the panelists as well if you have any questions to them. And if you have any questions regarding the call for papers as well, feel free to write to us and we are happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good weekend. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.